In previous videos, I've covered the aircraft carriers Amagi and Katsuragi. Those two were the final Japanese aircraft carriers to reach completion. Neither one saw proper combat service, mind you, outside of being bombed in port. Bombings that sank Amagi and damaged Katsuragi, leaving the latter as Japan's last functional fleet carrier at the end of the Pacific War, for a certain value of functional with a blasted out flight deck. There were, however, 3 other fleet carriers at various stages of completion, as well as a lighter carrier in the form of Ibuki, which I've also covered on the channel. For today, however, we'll be looking at those last 3 fleet carriers, the final members of the Unryu class to get any real progress done. Aso, Kasagi, and Ikoma, the final gasp of Japan's aircraft carrier program. This won't be a particularly long video due to the ships not being completed, but I feel they're worth a video of their own to show what the Japanese were planning had their industry not been bombed to rubble. Let's start with the most complete of the 3 in the form of Kasagi. This ship was laid down on April 14th, 1943 and launched on October 19th, 1944. Construction progressed at a relatively fast pace considering the situation by this point of the war. Resources were getting scarcer and most of the material that reached Japan went to higher priority projects: aircraft, submarines, and repairing existing ships. In spite of this, the Japanese managed to get Kasagi to around 80% complete by April 1945, 2 years after the ship was laid down. That's about on par with typical Japanese construction times. For example, Katsuragi was laid down in December 1942 and commissioned in October 1944. However, by April 1945, the Japanese simply couldn't afford to spend time and effort on incomplete ships, especially aircraft carriers. Even if Kasagi had been completed, she wouldn't have had aircraft or pilots. Neither Amagi or Katsuragi did by this point of the war. As such, construction was halted in April 1945, no more than 85% complete at best. Now that said, what sort of ship was Kasagi? Well, that's an interesting question because the Unryu class varies quite a bit between ships. The basic design is best described as a modified Hiryu. The island's superstructure was moved to starboard from port, and the power plant was simplified either to cruiser machinery or destroyer machinery, depending on the ship. Otherwise, the hull form was mostly the same, outside of having 2 elevators instead of 3. The displacement was also mostly the same, at least as designed, roughly 17,000 tons standard and 20,000 fully loaded. This did vary between the ships. It also isn't surprising because the Unryus were the Japanese going, let's build as many ships as fast as we can, especially in the aftermath of the disaster that was Midway. In any case, as Kasagi was closest in design to Amagi, we'll use that ship as our basis here. At a length of 227 meters, 745 feet, and a beam of 22 meters, 72 feet, Kasagi was on the smaller end for a fleet carrier in 1945, a bit over 100 feet shorter than an Essex with a much narrower beam. Similarly, the ship was also on the lighter end. As noted before, roughly 17,000 tons standard and 20,000 fully loaded, if she were completed. This would have allowed for an air wing of somewhere between 50 to 60 aircraft, although the exact number is difficult to say, not least because the planned air group for the Unryus varies between sources. The highest number I've seen is 71 aircraft, split between 21 Zeros, 18 D4Y Suisei or Judy bombers, and a further 21 B6N Tenzan or Jill bombers, with a further 11 aircraft stored in a deck park split between 9 dive bombers and 2 torpedo bombers. On the other end of the spectrum, the lowest number is 27 Zeros, 12 D4Ys, and 9 B6Ns, 48 aircraft in all. For what it's worth, warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy cite 64 aircraft, but doesn't give a detailed breakdown. In the end, it's largely academic because Kasagi wasn't completed. The same applies to her defensive weaponry. 6 twin 12.7 centimeter 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, 2 pairs carried forward of the bridge, and a final pair carried on either side of the aft elevator, supported by the usual swarm of 25mm guns, as designed 51 barrels. It would likely have been far more had the ship been completed. Somewhere between 60 to 100, depending on the source you use for Amagi. Similarly, while Warships doesn't cite this, the ship would probably carry 6 anti-aircraft rocket launchers. A very questionable utility, as these were basically rocket versions of the Type 3 Beehive shell, set to burst at a specific altitude to throw shrapnel at aircraft. Very pretty, but rarely effective. Even less effective would have been the 6 depth charge throwers. This was an, oh my god, we need to do something about those submarines now, defense put on Katsuragi and Amagi. Regardless, that rounds things off aside from the speed, which again varied between the ships. Being closest in design to Amagi, Kasagi would have used the power plant of an Ibuki-class heavy cruiser, providing 152,000 shaft horsepower for 34 knots through 4 shafts. As we move on, I'll direct you back to this part of the video for overall design features. While there were variations in the designs, this is largely the same across our 3 ships today. Right, back to Kasagi. Her incomplete hull was left in port in Japan, where the ship was fortunate enough to escape air attack during the closing stages of the war, at least to my knowledge. Something very apparent when you look at a picture of her from above. You see a remarkably intact and complete hull for this stage of the war, one that is lacking in weaponry, but also not a bombed-out husk like so many others. She is listing a bit, admittedly, but I'm not sure if that's from near-miss bomb damage or an attempt at scuttling. Of course, while this was a lucky break for Kasagi, it wasn't going to save the ship. When the Japanese surrendered, this carrier was one of a handful of incomplete ships floating around Japan. And just like the others, for example Ibuki, the ship was doomed, not to being sunk, but to the scrapper's torch. The Japanese weren't allowed to keep their fleet, and the Allies had no interest in completing these ships. The British were about to seriously downsize the Royal Navy, and the United States frankly had more carriers than it knew what to do with, even ignoring the differences in design and construction. So, despite her advanced state of completion and lack of damage, Kasagi would be scrapped by the end of 1948, after being examined by curious American occupiers and used as a mooring spot for captured submarines. Which brings us to our second ship, Aso. If Kasagi was closest to Amagi, well, Aso was closest to Katsuragi. What this means for the ship is simple. While broadly the same as her sister ships in overall design, Aso was fitted with a repurposed destroyer power plant, or more accurately, two of them. Those two destroyer power plants came from one of two classes, either based on the Kagero class or the Akizuki class, depending on which source you use. Regardless, this led to a lower overall performance, 104,000 shaft horsepower for around 32 knots on Katsuragi. Aso would probably have been similar had she been completed, which she wasn't, not even close. Aso was laid down on June 8, 1943, and launched on November 1st, 1944. Slightly ahead of Kasagi, but construction was stopped soon after she was launched, either in November 1944 or January 1945, again depending on the source. Possibly the Kure Arsenal, the builders, were simply too busy with repair and refit work to bother with a new ship. Or maybe the destroyer power plant was in higher demand. Detailed records are, as you could expect, rather sparse. Regardless, Aso was left at only around 60% completion, and unlike Kasagi, she would not escape American attention. The ship was bombed in Kure on July 24, 1945, and heavily damaged, with her hulk used for testing experimental warheads after this point, for as little of the war was left. Aso would, much like her sister ship, be broken up in 1947 through 1948. And if you're ever curious about what a 60% complete aircraft carrier looks like, this is a good example. Something that also applies to the final ship here in Ikoma. This ship was the first of a further simplified subclass, with the changes here primarily revolving around the power plant, which had a different layout. A different layout, but the same 152,000 shaft horsepower of the more standard Unryus. Otherwise, the design was more or less the same, although warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy cites a smaller air wing of 54 aircraft. Why? It doesn't say, though it's worth remembering the lower figure of 48 aircraft given for the older ships. In any event, Ikoma was left in a similar state to Aso. She was laid down on July 5, 1943, and launched on November 17, 1944. Mostly to clear her slipway, because the ship was hardly worked on after the launch. She only reached a similar 60% completion, or thereabouts. This has led to some confusion when regarding this picture. It's an incomplete Unryu-class ship, but it's also not entirely clear if this is Ikoma or Aso. Both of the ships were in a similar state of completion, and both of the ships were badly damaged in air raids on July 24, 1945. So really, this could be either ship. Regardless of which ship that picture depicts in the end, Ikoma's fate was the same. Repaired enough to be put in dock, and then scrapped post-war. The final Japanese fleet carrier to get anywhere approaching completion. The remaining Ikoma-class ships were never begun. Only one even got close to a name, either Kurama or Kaimon. The rest were victims of the changing war condition. Much like our three examples today, a case of the Japanese running out of time and material for their grand naval plans. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And I'll see you in the next one.